So I'm to talk about Christianity and evil. I'm going to try to do a couple of things. One is just kind of give a general background within which the discussion of the problem of evil has taken place within Christianity. I would say Judeo-Christianity because much of the material we have for the problem of evil does come out of the Old Testament. But of course it is our reading of the Old Testament. Then what I will do is work through historically to give you some idea as to how this has been worked on within Christianity, so that you have some idea of, well, who has been doing what have we been saying, and have we reached a conclusion to the matter? And that probably is something we haven't done. There are, for Christians, the question really is, why does God allow such horrific evil to continue? If you think about the problem of evil in three ways, we could ask the question, why did God allow evil into the world anyway? Couldn't he have done something different? The second question is, well, once this has happened, why does God continue to allow this evil? And we're not talking about, you know, a broken leg. We're talking about some very horrific acts of evil, both in intensity and in scope. And the other question is what God might do with evil once it's already into the, shall I say, flow of history. Those are three separate questions. I focus mainly on the second of those questions, but they necessarily will touch on the other two. For Christianity, the basic frame that we understand does teach that Christ defeated evil by his death, his burial, and his resurrection, and one day will destroy evil completely in the eschaton, known as his kingdom. The question before philosophers and theologians is now, why is this happening? Why doesn't God step in? Why doesn't he do something? And this is particularly true of children. Why is it that children have to suffer when supposedly, by some definition, they're innocent? And often they are hurt, they suffer, because of choices made by adults, and they had no choice in the matter whatsoever. Why doesn't God step in and do something for the children, particularly when Jesus has so many things to say about children? How that they're angels, are before the Father's face always. Now, I don't want to be blasphemous, but as one who is critiquing or objecting to Christianity, I might say, so what? So what? They're angels are before the Father's face always. So what does that matter? Doesn't seem to make any difference at all. So we're trying to find a question to give a reasonable answer or explanation. Is how is God morally justified in allowing evil to continue in his creation? Now, this is called a theodicy, but we now have what we call theodicies, and we have defenses. I'm more doing with theodicy. A defense simply says these might be some reasons why God allows evil. However, a theodicy says these are the reasons. I tend to be more, these are the reasons. That kind of, that probably strikes you as being filled with hubris. I'm not sure. But I think if we haven't done something that's somewhat objective, I'm not sure what we have done. And it is precisely because of who God is in the claim of the Christian. He is the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, just, loving God. Well, now surely he's also creator. If he created this, yes, then it doesn't look like that kind of a God's in charge of anything, if you look at all that goes on. But it is precisely that creates the great, I should say, not just existential, because it does create an existential, but it also creates philosophical and a theological The idea is, if God is perfectly good, then he must be willing to prevent evil. And if he is all-powerful, then certainly he can defeat all evil. And you heard that put out. Then it says, well, if there's evil, then it's either one or two things. Either God is not willing to do it, or he might be willing, but he's not able, or he might be able, but he's not willing. Now that, by the way, is a philosophical problem, because it's a logical fallacy there called the false dilemma. And we can just kind of set that aside. The matter of, for Christians, is, I think, one of the interesting things for me, as I study this over the years, is the fact that some of the evil that is most often brought up as an objection to God's existence comes out of the Bible itself. Look at the Old Testament. And I'm thinking, if I wanted to write a book, assuming that the Bible is God's word, if I wanted to write a book about myself and I'm an all-good, wonderful person, I wouldn't put all the evil in the Old Testament that God put it there. In fact, if he wouldn't have put it there, we'd never known about it. Think about Joshua going into the land and killing even the women and the children. How do you know about that? It's in the Bible. Well, if I were writing a book, it would, that, for myself, I wouldn't put that in there. Now, what that seems to say to me is that there must be an understanding, there must be a, not a paradox, I'm not one big for paradox or mystery, though I think there is mystery, but not in this count. If God puts us in his Bible, in his word, then it would seem to me these are not somehow incoherent claims, all right? So for the Christian, we cannot deny the reality of evil, and redefining God is not an acceptable solution. So it seems to me the reality of evil, no redefining God, would be if we redefine God. That would then be quite self-defeating, because then there's nothing to defend. Just let it be. And if we deny suffering, then that's rather naive. Now I have some of my friends who think that that might be the way to go, or that God doesn't define evil the same way that we do. Well, if that's the way of it, then why don't you just go home and play a board game or something? Because if you get to right to say God didn't really mean that, or he has different definitions, then all of his communication to us would be rather, I think, rather worthless. So we must find out, is there a way that these things can be harmonized in a coherent, intellectual fashion, both theologically and philosophically. I want to say just a couple of things about Christian theism so that we understand where I would be coming from, because I'm looking at the Christian tradition, and so we first start seeing works being done on the problem of evil at the very early Christianity. All right? We know most about that from Augustine. So Christian theism, as understood very early on, it's a Trinitarian theology that's set forth in the first and the second of the seven ecumenical councils, 325 through 787. And the first, of course, was the Council of Nicaea, and then it was followed up with Constantinople. Those were mainly Trinitarian issues, and particularly Christology, but they outlined for us what the church's view was on the God that they worshipped. This became known, once codified by Thomas Aquinas, as classical theism, or St. Anselm of Canterbury, who spoke of this as being most perfect being theology. Of course, evil itself, the term, appears in the Bible over 600 times, and it has a very wide range of meaning, but always referring to acts or character, actively malignant or not so actively, and it refers to both moral and natural evil. I would also include, though some people break it down into three categories, moral evil, natural evil, and physical evil. I just take physical evil and natural evil and put them into one. But natural evil would be tsunamis, earthquakes, and then of course physical evil would be something like heart attacks, cancer, and things of that notion. When we talk about, most of the literature will not define evil. You know, we've been talking a lot about good, and I don't hear anybody saying, here's a clear definition of what good is. There is an assumption in all of this. Their assumption is that we as human beings made in God's image already have a pretty good idea of what good is and what evil is. So we do not necessarily parse it out, though we know how to call it by its name when we see it. The book of James mentions Satan as being a real being in an adversarial relationship to God. We've talked about that already. Job is, Satan is rather upset with God that he is, that the only reason that Job has been faithful to him is because God is giving him a lot of goodies and he's bought him off. And so the book of Job goes to prove that is not true. In Genesis 3:1, we have the tempter, is named the serpent. In Revelation 20, verse 2, the serpent is identified as the devil and Satan. When Jesus is on this earth, the religious leaders said that Jesus was casting out demons by Beelzebub, and Jesus connects Beelzebub with Satan. And of course, that indicates, as Jesus said, that he could, it was all designed, the conversation makes it very clear that Christianity has always been against any concept of ontological dualism. That is, Satan and God are different, and different in entity and by definition, but also ontologically. The big issues for Christianity in the problem of evil is the idea of free will, or, as it was said earlier, free choice. We see that very early on in, for example, in Augustine, but actually for the first 400 years, all the way up to 412, when Augustine changes his mind on this. But all the ancient theologians were what we would call libertarian freedom. That is, that man was able to choose. He could choose A, he could choose non-A. He was able to choose contraries. That was the position of the church. So all the early theodicies, including Augustine's, is based upon this notion that man has free will as a causal agent. But then the question comes, if he has free will, which is not a very good term, but we'll use it, what does this mean? What is the extent? There's what we call compatibilist, where it says that God's sovereignty and man's freedom are somehow compatible. And then we have the idea of what is called libertarian freedom, that takes a different view on the idea of God's relationship to humanity. Most compatibilists, in the Christian sense, believe that Adam and Eve had free will pre-fall, but not post-fall, because sin has rendered his will as incapable of exercising a will among contraries, but will in only one direction, which is always in the negative direction. The reason that comes up is who's going to be responsible. You see, if man does not have free will, then you don't have a whole lot of candidates for who's responsible for evil. And that was one of the reasons that the early church held to some form of free will, in order to make sure that at the end, that God's not held morally accountable. Sovereignty plays a major role in the Christian response to evil. That is, how do we understand God's sovereignty? Do we understand it determinative? That is, that God determines everything that happens. That, of course, would discount free will. I'm kind of giving you the extremes. Or do we think that sovereignty is more simply something like control as a husband would be in control of his home, not making all the choices for everybody in the home, but simply making sure that things kept going in the right direction. And those of you who have been parents know that that's not an easy task. It's much easier for God. There's a soft view of that. It's called Meticulous Providence. And that simply argues that God only allows that evil into the world from which he can bring about a greater good. And I'll say something about that. Christians began their theodicies on ontological foundations, which understood that we live, that I would say that they held to what we call a metaphysical realism. That one begins with God as a self-existent one, or the necessary being who brings all contingent reality into existence. The creation narrative presents a reality consisting of physical and metaphysical elements. And then 2 Corinthians 4:18 talks about things seen, things not seen, things eternal, things that are temporal. The early church affirmed this in the Nicene Constantinople Creed, which emphasizes the existence of natures or essences, one of the key issues of metaphysical realism. I would just put that there. That was a big issue for the Nicene Council. According to Genesis 1:26 and 27, Adam and Eve were made in the image of God. The word used in the context, that is image, means a shadow image. It also says, and God made them in his likeness. And the word for image is the Hebrew tselem, the Hebrew word tselem, and the word for likeness is demuth. So they are two different words. However, most of the early church did not see them as talking about something substantially different. And this was codified much in the writings of Augustine, as he says that man was made morally perfect. He's made in God's image. Now obviously he's not omniscient, he can't be, because he's a created being, and that excludes being omnipotent or omniscient. And that man from the hand of God was in fact morally perfect, in the sense that a contingent being could be perfect, okay? And it was through an act of disobedience that Augustine talks about, and this act of disobedience is what brings about what is commonly referred to as vitiated or corrupted. That not only is man corrupted, but all of creation is corrupted. And hence, this is how evil comes into the world. Those who follow the Augustine develop what is called, as you might think, the Augustine theodicy, known as the greater good theodicy. Now there's another view that is put forth by Irenaeus. He was before Augustine, chronologically. And he said there's a difference between image of God and likeness. Now he said you can't make the claim exegetically, but it just helps out my position if we can make image one and likeness something else. So Irenaeus says that man was made in the image of God, but he was rationally he was in perfection, but he was not in God's likeness. That is, he needed to be perfected in that area. In this view, suffering is the way in which God brings one into maturity. So if you take so Irenaeus and Augustine are going to set out two traditions that are going to make their way through Christian answers to the problem of evil. One, as I have indicated, the difference between an Irenaean and an Augustinian present these two views of suffering. Irenaeus would say, well, you need this suffering in order to perfect man because he's immature. He comes from the hand of God, but he's not matured yet spiritually, and for him to reach his beatific vision, to become what God intended him to become, he needs suffering. So in that case, suffering is all for a good purpose. It's all good for making man what he ought to be, to grow up, so to speak, to be in the image, the likeness of God. All early and most present-day theodicies claim that man had libertarian freedom prior to the fall, but now many in what we call the Reformed or the Calvinistic frame do not accept libertarian freedom. I'm going to take several of the more prominent theodicies, though you might debate about Augustine's, to show you how throughout history from the 2nd century up to the 21st century, how Christianity has been dealing with this. Obviously, its overview. In Augustine's City of God, among other things, he did try to harmonize the existence of evil with the reality of God's existence. Remember when Augustine was living and the invasion from the north. And of course the Romans said, well, this has all happened because Christians have taken our gods away from us and left us exposed. And Augustine says, no, no, that's not the way of it at all. He thinks that what God created was created out of nothing, and it was good when it came from the hand of God. Genesis 1:31. That is, everything is created by God's thinking. God is perfect, therefore he can have no negative thoughts, he can have no evil thoughts. So God thinks something that brings it into existence. God's mind is perfect, therefore what comes into creation, into being, is all good. There's no evil, according to Augustine, in a part of original creation. He developed his theodicy on the account of human free will, and as did most, and said, well, but this is the best you can get. Why give man free will at such risk? Well, because Augustine said it's better to have a runaway horse than a stone. It's better to have beings that can actually make choices and add to history than just to have stones. For Augustine, the human will is good, but he chose the lesser good, the physical goods, and thus disobeying God. Now, Augustine is one of the first ones who's going to try to help us to understand how is it if everything that came from God in the Genesis account was very good, and that included man, the tree, and the garden, but it also included this notion of will. If the will is good, how in the world did it turn bad? How did it turn in the wrong direction? That's a very good question. Well, Augustine has an answer for that. Just to let you know that he does. It was that there were three goods: the higher good, the middle good is the will, and the lower good were the physical things. They're good, but they're not the higher good, and man chose to turn downward, and that's what then is how sin came into the world. That's Augustine's explanation. In summary, Augustine's theodicy begins with a benevolent, omnipotent God creating all things. All things were good. Evil enters in, corrupting creation by Adam's free choice in disobeying God. Evil, for Augustine, and about everybody from that time on, is going to conclude the same thing. Evil has no essence of its own. Evil is the privation of the good. So it makes it strange when you read Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas says, oh, without good, you couldn't have evil. Well, that's right, but you have to understand what he's saying there. He's just simply saying that if there was no good, there could be no privation of the good, and if evil is privation, then you have to have good in order to have the evil. And the big thing about Augustine is his view of the greater good. And so his theodicy is called the greater good theodicy, and it follows all the way through, right down to the 21st century, where most of the people, most of my colleagues would subscribe to some form of a greater good. That is, that God only allows that evil into this world from which he can bring about a greater good or prevent a worse evil. Okay? Well, the last part's ridiculous, in my humble opinion, because it deals with counterfactual. How do we know And there's no scripture to tell us that's what he did. So most people focus on the first, that God only allows that evil. Notice he doesn't say he creates the evil or designs the evil, though some Christians will say that. It just simply says that God is monitoring this, and he said, oh, that evil is allowed because I can bring a greater good from it. So if you think about something like what happened in 9/11, in September in 2001, the trade towers, many Christians said the reason that God allowed this to happen was because he's going to bring about a greater good from it. Now the only problem there is defining out what is the good. It becomes quite arbitrary if you listen to them talk. Thomas Aquinas just keeps pretty much in step with Augustine. So Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, you're going to have both Catholic and Protestant, who are going to hold basically the same thing. Then you have, in the 17th century, you have Gottfried Leibniz, and Leibniz actually writes a book called The Odyssey, and he is going to start the same way. God is all good, all powerful, etc. And the creation is good, so no evil comes from the mind of God. In the Augustinian tradition, however you wish, Leibniz agrees the central issue in the problem of evil is the reality of man's free will. That's what Augustine said up to 412. In 412, Augustine changes his mind and becomes very deterministic. But he's already developed his theodicy by that time. Man brought corruption, same way, by choosing to disobey God over the command about the tree in the garden. Leibniz explained if one has free will, has led to all the suffering, so one must explain why the will turned in that direction. He said, well, there's an answer to that. Man's a created being. Because he's created, he's finite, he's limited, he doesn't have all information. But being created, being finite, is not a flaw. It's just the way things are. So Leibniz said, well, that's why he made a wrong choice when it came to the tree, because he didn't have sufficient information. You may not think that's a good idea, but that's what Leibniz is teaching. Leibniz introduces something into the discussion that nobody had to this point, and that is, he thinks this is the best of all possible worlds. So, you know how that comes up. That's why Leibniz is known as Mr. Pangloss. This creation includes the tree is good, includes the knowledge of good and evil, nothing evil about the tree. So what Leibniz says is that God in his moral perfections, if he's going to create a world, isn't God obligated, but not obligated of necessity, but obligated of ontological fact. If he is this kind of a God, then he would have to do the very best he did, and if he didn't, now you've got a claim against God. This mess with God. We got it because God didn't do his best. Now I am of the persuasion this is the best of all possible worlds. I stand in the minority on that, but I'm willing to defend my position. I agree with Leibniz. Leibniz thinks that God actualizes the best of all possible worlds. He held what is commonly called today is Molinism, kind of like it's middle knowledge, which was that he believed that God saw all the possible worlds before he actualized anyone. He saw all the choices you ever made, all the prayers you ever made, who was there, what you did under this condition, what you've done under that condition. God looks at all those worlds, and then he makes a judgment of what's the best of those worlds, and that's the world we have. Now don't ask me how those choices are made. I think there are explanations. Leibniz also holds to some form of a greater good theodicy. You can look at greater good in two different ways. One is a general greater good, that is, at the end of the day, the good weighs out. That's a general. The specific good is something like what Augustine believed. When someone asked Augustine, well, why did the child die? He said, it's simple. The good that God brings out of the child dying is that what? That will make better parents. Well, now, But I hear many within in my evangelical friends, my Protestant friends, who say the same thing. Oh, well, that happened because God is going to bring some good. John Hick, now John Hick is going to take the Irenaean view. And John Hick is going to argue that this whole thing, man being made in the likeness of God, is all about him learning to love God. In fact, he calls that a soul making, and according to Hick, there is an epistemic distance between man and God, and this distance in epistemic terms is so that man can be totally free to choose to love God. See, if God was hovering over you, you had better make sure that you do what God wants you to do. So God has to maintain an epistemic distance so you are totally free. Now, for Hick, he thinks that there is no gratuitous evil. That means that everybody will reach their perfected state, this beatific vision. Everybody's going to meet it. Well, he said, yeah, I know, it doesn't look like everybody leaves this world very mature, loving God. So, he says the solution to that is, it will happen post-mortem. That is, God will put you through evil, suffering in post-mortem state, but it will do its job, and you will end up loving God. Another one who takes an Irenaean view, by the way, that view is what we call universal salvation. Everybody gets saved because love wins. Richard Swinburne takes the same Irenaean view and works his way through it, takes pretty much the same position as does John Hick, but Swinburne says, I'm going to tell you, I can even tell you what the reasons are. See, the big question, if you do the greater good theodicy, is, the question is, where's the good? And then, where's the good? Then you got to figure out, well, how does the good outweigh the evil? I haven't found any units in the Bible that would tell me that 10 units of evil are outweighed by 15 units of good. So this is highly problematic in my way of thinking. And Swinburne realizes, he thinks the same thing, we're going to reach our maturity, but not everybody that leaves this planet does in fact reach their maturity. So he said, in particularly good-hearted pagans, those who just didn't have enough knowledge to make the most use of their suffering so they could turn to love God. Now, he has a solution very much like Hick, and that is what everybody's going to be perfected post-mortem. If you don't do it in time, you'll get an opportunity to do it in post-mortem. Swinburne says, I know that sounds like purgatory. It's not. Something like it, but it's not really purgatory. And then he said, yeah, and even the good-hearted pagans, but he said, you've got to realize that when Jesus said there'll be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, some people just never get perfected. So they will go to hell. But it's okay, because, well, I don't know if it's okay, but it's not eternal suffering like many Christians had believed. It is the annihilation of the wicked. He said it's not fair for God to punish you eternally for temporal sin. So if you don't make the grade, you don't get to love God, you don't reach the beatific vision, and you do have to go in this hot place as it's told to be, then it will only be for a while. You will be eventually, you just cease to exist, which raises questions. Can the soul cease to exist? But I'm not here to answer that question today. So, greater good theodicy, which is the one that pretty much prevails through Christianity today, both in Catholic and in Protestant, and as well as Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox follow very much the Irenaean view. So the greater good theodicy, the good always prevails, either generally or specifically. Sin is a privation. And there is no gratuitous evil. Every evil has a purpose. And that is, for me, quite difficult to explain. And so I don't try. Therefore, I don't make a claim to it, so I don't have to defend it. I'm sorry, that's kind of rapid, but I wanted to get as much forth as I could. Thank you.